Greetings, traveler. Have you ever started working on a new game prototype and found yourself at a loss on what values to assign to each game parameter, the character movement speed, the attack speed, and so on? I have certainly found myself in that situation plenty of times, and today what I want to do is share my framework for starting work on a new game and assigning these new parameters, especially if it is a realistic game that we're working on. My name is Xanthos. I've been working in the games industry for over 14 years now, and something that always struck me as amazing is whenever we started working on a new game project, nobody had any guidelines in the game design team about what values to initially give to our game. So if our game would have a car moving, how fast should that car go? Or if our game had a skateboard, for example, how fast that would be? Or if it was a human playing soccer, well, how fast does that need to be? So we would always assign random numerical values like 10 or 100 and so on for the speed, and every other game aspect, of course. And that would make our lives extremely difficult later on when we were balancing, because then we had to balance for two things at once. One would be balance every value to every other value in the game to make sure that the game feels right. And the other part was to choose the values in such a way that things would still be realistic. So needless to say, this was a nightmare. The balancing process took months and months and months. And when it was time for me to start to work on my current game, which is again on the realistic side, I came up with the same situation again. I would start creating objects and have to decide speed and turning speed and movement rate through the air and so on. And out of habit, I would start assigning values based on what felt good inside the prototype. But then I remembered the problem that I had every single time we started a new project over the years. And this time I decided to take a different approach. So to better understand this approach, it's probably better for me to explain my two golden core principles when thinking of game balance on a high level. And those are: one, having the game behave in a way that feels realistic for its context. What does that mean? That means that it doesn't matter if you're really working on a fantasy game or a super realistic game or a cartoon game or whatever. What matters is that things behave in the expected way inside the game. So to put this into an example, if you're making a realistic soccer game, then it would be unrealistic for the ball to teleport from one player to the other, right? You would expect the ball to take time to travel through the air in the rate that everybody's used to. Or it would be unrealistic for a player to be able to run 10 times faster than any other player on the field. You would expect some people to be slightly faster or slightly slower, but in no case would a player be 10 times faster than anybody else. So that's a realistic example. And a cartoon, more like a loose kind of world example, would be whatever essentially the game designer puts in the game. So the rules that you set in the beginning of the game, for example, if you throw an apple to an enemy, that enemy explodes. That is, again, it doesn't make any sense in the real world, but in the game world, once you set that standard early in the game, then the player expects that standard to continue throughout the game, unless you specifically say why that wouldn't be the case anymore. So it would be strange for you to throw an apple at every enemy and the enemy to explode, and then suddenly throw it at a new enemy and do nothing. Then, unless you explain why that new enemy is special, it would just feel odd to the player. The second golden rule I have for game balance is that based on the amount of effort the player puts in the game, he should get a reward that feels just for the amount of effort. Now again, this is a complex concept, but an easy way to understand this is to think, let's say you make a prototype and it's a quick 5-minute prototype where the player can clear the whole content in 5 minutes. Maybe it's just one stage of something. And the unspoken agreement that you set with the player is that if you engage in some activity for, let's say, 30 seconds, then you would earn 10 gold. So in the player's mind, that sets the golden standard in a sense, where for every 30 seconds he spends actively engaged in some activity, he knows he would earn 10 gold. So if you choose to expand the game later on and you make a different activity where the player spends 30 seconds and only earns 5 gold or 1 gold, then players might be inclined to describe this activity as unbalanced or unfun, or this game is horrible, or something similar. So this simply happens because the expectation that was set in the beginning for how much reward you would expect to get for the amount of effort you put in is broken. So as long as that relationship is maintained, the game keeps feeling quote-unquote balanced. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that you always have to maintain this relationship, or otherwise the game breaks. You can, of course, make new activities. In fact, you are expected to make new activities as the game goes on, that for the same amount of time give a higher reward. So for the same 30 seconds, the game can engage in new activities further down the game for 12 gold, 15 gold, and so on. And that subconsciously communicates to the player that, look, now that you're more experienced, you have a higher leverage on the world and getting rewards for the world than you did when you were completely inexperienced. Or, of course, it's possible to have activities that still take the same amount of time, but are much harder than that original experience you set in the beginning. So for the game to reward you for this extra difficulty, then a proportionally higher reward is necessary. And let me hit upon this point quickly because I think it's an important one. So let's say a basic activity takes 30 seconds and gives 10 gold, and it's of medium difficulty. If you design a new activity that also takes 30 seconds but is considered hard, especially by the game designer, which means it's going to be really, really hard for the players who try it for the first time, then the player doesn't just expect twice the reward because the activity is, let's say, twice as hard. The player would expect 4 times or more the reward to make it worth it to him, because here you have an exponential effect of the amount of effort and the return you get. So 2 times the effort doesn't mean 2 times the reward. Maybe 4 or even 10 times the reward is expected by the player. But that really depends on the activity. But the important point here is that as effort goes up, reward should go up exponentially and not linearly. So anyway, let's get back, now that we have a better understanding on these 2 guiding principles on game balance, let's get back to how we can make assigning starting values for realistic type games much easier. So what I did in our game is I wanted to decide an initial speed for the airships. Now, of course, that speed would vary greatly depending on the airship type and how good quality the machinery on it is and how good the crew is, and many, many parameters. But before we go in and we start tweaking with all these things, I wanted the base airship, like with no upgrades, with nothing done to it, to feel right for the player. And since it's a realistic type of game, which doesn't mean it's a simulation, but it's closer to reality than, let's say, a cartoon game, I wanted as much as possible to make the game feel right. And that's another problematic word in the game design world, because feel right is very subjective, right? What feels right changes from person to person. So I thought, well, what golden standard can I have for things such as movement speed, since everybody might have a different opinion on this. Well, when we look at the real world, it's not about everyone's opinion, especially for measurable things such as car speed limits, airplane flying speeds, and so on. That's no longer an opinion, and it's just a factual number. So I don't know if it's the most fun in the world to use these numbers as they are, but I found it's a better starting place than having to decide on a random value. Let's say for deciding the speed of an airship, instead of going with a random value like 322, to go with something that is recognizable from the real world. So things that I considered were the speed of a large truck, one of those like 2 double, triple lorries that they use in Australia and so on, or an actual airship like the Zeppelin, or probably I thought something closer to the feeling I wanted to have was something like a submarine. So the way a submarine moves through the water, a modern submarine, would probably be closer to the type of experience I want to design than a car or an airplane and so on. So then I researched a little bit about modern submarine speeds, and I was horrified because these things are fast nowadays. I'm like, okay, I don't know if we can use the fastest of the speed to start with in the game, but taking one of the existing submarine speeds and using that as a baseline achieved two things for me. One, I had a real world counterpart to reference for values. And remember here, it's not just a forward moving speed that we're interested in. We will have to talk about turning left and turning right and reversing and climbing and diving. So all the things an airship might do, I would have to eventually assign parameters to. So again, instead of starting with random values that came out of nowhere for me, having a real world comparison just made things easier, not for the final product, but to get started. So I found this approach to be extremely helpful, not only because it provided some real world values to start with, but also because later on, down the line, when those speeds would have to be compared inside the game with the player's real world knowledge, they would make more sense. So what do I mean by that? When we compare, for example, how fast cannonballs fly when shot from the airship, then inevitably players will have to compare their speed to the speed of the airship, right? Or a better example might be missiles, for example. If a ship shoots a missile towards another ship, another airship, and that missile is actually slower than the airship itself, then that wouldn't make any sense, right? So there again, we have the real world to rely upon, so we can look at some real world speeds and get a feeling about what seems logical and what seems normal in a physics sort of sense, so we don't have any weirdness inside the game. And here you might be thinking, well, why does all this matter? Who cares what the real world does? As long as it's fun in the game, it should be fine, right? That is certainly a viewpoint, but I had this experience in a game once, and that it really changed my mind about this. So it was specifically in GTA 5 when I was doing some of the air combat missions, and some of them included some pretty modern fighter jets. So these things go incredibly fast. They are incredibly advanced technologically. They are basically almost at the peak of what humanity can produce right now. So very fast, very maneuverable, can break the barrier of sound in speeds. So very capable things. However, when I was playing those missions, the point of the missions were to do dogfighting. So you and another jet chase each other and try to shoot each other and so on. So that sequence in itself made sense inside the game. So when I was trying to fight another player, I didn't notice any weirdness. The weirdness came when I saw how fast I was flying compared to the ground. So in the game, it felt like I was going really, really fast when I was chasing this other player. But when I looked at how fast I was going compared to the ground, I was almost stationary. So if you have that game, if you can play it and check it out for yourself, that might be an interesting exercise. But basically, the game designers there had to make the actual speed of the fighter jets so low that it completely destroyed any sort of immersion I could get out of these missions, and it brought down the level of experience I personally had. Now, this is not to say that they did a bad job and they should change it. Of course not. I'm just talking about my own personal experience with this and my motivation. So, of course, the relative speeds were good because the relative speed of one fighter jet to the other were still somewhat okay, so that's why we could have a good dogfight. But the absolute speed of the planes was orders of magnitude different than what it is in real life, which for me it made the experience somewhat worse. And I thought, well, if we could have both, if we could have a good relative speed and relative good experience while experiencing this, and at the same time keep close to world speeds and turning speeds and values and so on, then that just makes the balancing process that much easier, because we're checking for in-game balance and real world expectation based on the knowledge that people already have in their heads about the real world. We can keep those two in sync with minimal effort, of course, and thus getting a better realistic experience. Anyway, these are my thoughts on the topic. I know it's a pretty deep dive into game balance and into player perception. But I would love to hear your opinion on this, or if you have worked on a game like this and what approach you took. I'll be very much looking forward to reading it. Anyway, that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching. My throat is as always attacking me, but thank you for your time and have fun.